I'm Ricer with Dead Broke Barbecue, and I suppose you can tell that I'm from Wisconsin. Not only do we make a lot of beer cans and cheese here, we're also known for making sausage. But like my German blood would say, ich machen sie West. Up here in God's country, we make all kinds of fresh and cured sausage. But my favorite is still the standard Wisconsin-style bratwurst to make. And people here eat a lot of them. I mean, heck, parents up here save tons of money on buying pacifiers. They just shove a Wisconsin-style brat in their kid's mouth to keep them from crying. So grab a pen and some paper, sausage fans. We're gonna amplify some backyard barbecue fun. Around this neck of the woods, we call this recipe a Sheboygan brat. Not she-boy again, she-boy-gan. Now, most of you out there have had a Johnsonville brat before, but they're a lot weaker in flavor compared to what they were in the 70s. So figure that this recipe is a Johnsonville brat on steroids. You know, bussin' with the flavor. This recipe gives you a good base so you can experiment down the road. I mean, grab a couple grams of onion powder, toss it in, and now you've got an onion brat. Or a gram of sage, and now you got some breakfast links. The first time that I made brats was with an old retired butcher from Kaiserslautern, Germany. His name was George, and he used egg whites. Wunderbar! The other great thing about making brats is that it is a fresh sausage, so we don't have to worry about any cures or a fermentation process to deal with. This is a great recipe for all of you beginners. So there really isn't a big stress about screwing this recipe up. The first thing that we're gonna need for this recipe is some pork butt. Obviously, American pork butt has a perfect fat to meat ratio for any fresh sausage brats. I do trim off any of the blood spots or gobbledygook because I do not want to bite into that crap. And I can almost guarantee you that this recipe will develop phenomenal athletes. I mean, I'm just spitting some facts. It's proven, 100%. After I get all the pork butt trimmed up, I cut them into pieces that will easily fit down the throat of any grinder that I'm using that day. I weigh the pork butt and I write that info down because we're gonna need that information, so we add the correct ingredients. After it's all cut, I always put my meat back in the freezer so it can get nice and cold. I never want to grind any meat above 35 degrees, especially when I get into those 50-pound batches, because there's nothing worse than a sausage where the fat started to separate and melt. In my opinion, that becomes more of a drier bite. So always keep that meat nice and cold. While this meat is cooling down, it's a great time to get your ingredients out and start measuring them up. I always measure everything out in grams, including the meat, because it just makes it a lot easier. Number one, you'll be able to measure out the exact amounts that you need for a recipe, and number two, it makes it a lot easier if you're experimenting to be able to duplicate it in the future. It also makes it easier if you're gonna make a larger or a smaller batch. This way, your ingredients percentages are always gonna be the same. So get yourself a cheap gram scale. You'll want it to be able to measure in the tenths, but if you can find one that's in the hundreds, that's even a tad better. But they do get a little bit pricier. But this one here, that's like $20 on Amazon. For this recipe, you're going to need 10 ingredients. Obviously, we're gonna need pork butt. Then we're gonna need some sea salt, sugar or dextrose, and yeah, I've got a lot of dextrose. You're gonna need some ground coriander, nutmeg, caraway, marjoram, ginger, celery seed. Now on the last ingredient, this is where I kind of switch things up so I can end up with two different versions. On one batch, I'll use black pepper, and that's more of your standard Wisconsin-style brat. On the other batch though, I use white pepper, and that's a lot spicier. And I have to say that I think my family and I like them better. But if you're not a big peppery flavored person, you might just want to stick with the black pepper. And in my recipe, I do have white or black pepper. So you decide. But don't worry, I'll have the recipe for these Wisconsin-style brats in the description below. Now here's a pro tip. I always want my spices in more of a powder form when I'm making sausage. So I have this cheap little coffee grinder that comes in handy when I can't find any of my spices at the store that are already ground. Like the caraway, marjoram, and the celery seed, I always grind them up for about a half a minute so they can turn into more of a powder form. Now in my opinion, the ingredients just distribute a lot better in the mince when they're in powder form. Once I get all my spices done, I also like to measure out a little bit of distilled water. I want to keep it cold because you never know when you're mixing, you might need to add a little bit more moisture. You could substitute it with some cold beer, and yeah, now you have a beer brat. When grinding up fresh brats, I typically use a 6mm or a 1/4 inch plate. Sometimes I go up to a 10mm or a 3/8 inch plate just to liven things up a tad. And when I'm making a hot Italian sausage, I actually use a 12mm or a 1/2 inch plate. Yeah, it sounds a little crazy, but in my opinion, it actually gives you a better chew. So use whatever you like, but for this recipe, I prefer to use a 6mm or a 1/4 inch plate. I think it has the perfect chew and the perfect grind for a Wisconsin brat. Now here's a pro tip. When I'm using a bigger grind for any type of sausage, I do run the internal temperatures up a tad higher. I'll run them up to maybe right around 165, 170 because I want that fat to render a tad more. Also, when I make fresh sausage, I like to use my dual grind grinder. It certainly does a great job when I want a tighter grind without having to do a second pass. I mean, time is money. Once I get all the mince ground, it goes directly back into the freezer to stay cold while I get my stuffer set up. Yeah, I have to agree, I'm spoiled because I have an electric stuffer. But I was like a lot of you out there watching right now. I started out with some cheaper and kind of crappier stuff. But as I started to get into this hobby, I slowly upped my equipment. Yeah, there. Hey there. Once my mince is cooled down to 32 or 35 degrees, it's time to start blending up them spices. I always like to add my spices nice and slowly so they distribute evenly while they're mixing. Don't just dump it all in at once. On the small batches, I just hand mix it. Just keep on folding it over. On batches over 15 pounds, I get out my 25-pound mixer. On much larger batches, I get out my 50-pound mixer. It just makes it a lot easier. Mixing times just depends on how good you are by mixing it by hand or what type of equipment you're using. I can tell when my mince is done if I get a good tacky glob sticking to the bottom of my hand and it almost looks like it's starting to grow some hair on it. That means I've got a really good protein extraction. To stuff these Wisconsin style brats, I'm using the very popular 32 to 35 hog casing. To prep up these hog casings, it's really simple. Just get them out of the package, get them in some container under some hot water. Make sure you're rinsing off all the salt from packaging and let them soak for about 50 minutes to an hour. Then repeat step 1, but I always add some baking soda to those casings and let them sit until I'm ready to start stuffing. I typically like to let them soak for at least 3 hours because that makes them kind of slipperier and they're a lot easier to load on that horn. I also like to open them up and get a little water to run through them because that helps untwist those casings and they're a lot easier to load on that horn. Now, I always pack that canister nice and tight and try to get as much air out of it as I can. So just pack it tight. I personally do not tie the end of my casing. I just pinch it nice and tight and let the stuffer do the work. With an electric stuffer, this task is super easy. With a hand crank though, make sure that you have a heavy table because when you're putting some pressure on that crank, it's really easy to toss that table around. When I'm using this table and we're filming, I actually have to have my boys stand on each one of the corners to keep it down. When I'm making brats, I run my stuffer fast enough to fill up that casing about 3/4 full. And then I just coil them up. I sterilize my sausage prick and poke out any air pockets that I can. Go across the whole thing, get it nice and poked, and then I start making the links. That process can be done many different ways too. I typically just twist the first one and then pinch off and move over a spot and then twist the next one. You don't have to worry about getting these links exactly the same size. You're making brats. Somebody's gonna have a bigger one. We all know that from the shower room days. To be honest with you, the only thing that I'm worried about is that they fit in the vacuum bags that I have, so they fit in my vacuum chamber. After they're all linked up, I just put them in a pan and put them back in the fridge overnight. Number 1, that'll help those twists stiffen up a tad when you separate them. And number 2, that gives that mince and spice a little bit more time to get to know each other. Nice to meet you. When it comes to cooking Wisconsin-style brats, people here do it multiple different ways. Charcoal, gas, or sometimes they even cook them on a frying pan. My preferred way is to start out cooking them raw, then get them right around 150-ish degrees, and then get them in some beer and onions and let them braise at a low heat for about 20 minutes before serving. Just adding another layer of flavor. When cooking brats, cook them at a lower temperature. Not only do they cook a lot more evenly, it also helps so that the casings don't burst. When it comes to actually eating a brat, you can put whatever you want on it. Some people like sauerkraut and spicy brown mustard. Other people, well, they just want ketchup and mustard and some onions. Only fibs hate ketchup. And that ketchup reminds them of their players getting scraped off from Lambeau Field after playing the Packers. And you Bear fans know the past 5 years has been a bloodbath. Gotta love the Packers. Speaking of football, these Wisconsin-style brats are great for tailgating or that special weekend gathering with your friends and family. You know, you can have your very own Oompapa festival. Oompapa. I make this brat recipe at least 3 times during the summer. It's one of our family favorites. It is really, truly loaded with flavor. I hope all of you try and enjoy this recipe. But remember, I'm giving you the breakdowns so you can adjust it a tad and make it your very own Wisconsin-style brat made by you. I'm serious, these brats are very, very tasty. Get a good bun that helps too, but delicious. Well, that's all I got. Roll the nation. Scheißer Sie Hosen.